step into the shadowed halls of the Castellano estate, where power is absolute and mercy is completely non-existent. Arthur Castellano built his notorious empire on blood, fear, and absolute silence. He was a man who simply never made a mistake. But firing Nora Higgins, the quiet, unassuming maid who scrubbed his imported marble floors, was a fatal miscalculation that nearly tore his criminal dynasty apart. Why would a ruthless, untouchable mafia boss personally fire a desperate girl making minimum wage? And how did the sudden, chilling words of his mute 7-year-old son unravel a betrayal so deep it shook the entire New York underworld? Keep watching, because absolutely nothing is as it seems. Dust motes danced in the heavy, suffocating air of the Castellano estate's grand library. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a brutal November storm lashed against the reinforced glass, stripping the last of the dead leaves from the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder. Nora Higgins knelt on the Persian rug, her knuckles white as she aggressively polished the ornate mahogany legs of an antique desk. She was 22, exhausted, and desperately trying to become invisible. In a house owned by Arthur Castellano, invisibility was the only reliable survival strategy. Arthur was not merely a wealthy businessman, though his legitimate holdings in real estate and shipping were vast. He was the undisputed architect of the largest organized crime syndicate on the eastern seaboard. Federal agents like Detective Robert Harrison had spent decades trying to pin extortion, racketeering, and worse on him, but Arthur's operations were sealed airtight. The estate in Long Island was his fortress, guarded by men whose suits bulged under the left arm and whose eyes never stopped moving. Nora knew the rules: keep your head down, clean what you are told to clean, and never, ever look the boss in the eye. She was scrubbing a particularly stubborn scuff mark when the heavy oak doors of the library groaned open. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed against the hardwood border of the room. Nora froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't need to look up to know it was Arthur. He carried a distinct scent, a blend of expensive cedarwood cologne, freshly printed currency, and the subtle, sharp tang of ozone that always seemed to follow a violent thunderstorm. "Stand up, Miss Higgins." His voice was a low, resonant baritone that offered no room for negotiation. Nora scrambled to her feet, her grey uniform clinging to her damp skin. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the second button of his immaculate, charcoal grey bespoke suit. "Mr. Castellano, sir," she whispered, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. "I was just finishing the woodwork. I'll be out of your way in a moment." "You are already out of my way," Arthur said. He stepped further into the room, the dim light casting harsh, angular shadows across his sharp jawline and deep-set, uncompromising eyes. "Leave the rags. You are done." Nora blinked, her mind struggling to process the command. "Done, sir? I still have the east wing to dust, and Evelyn asks me to polish the silver before the dinner party." "You misunderstand me," Arthur interrupted, his tone chillingly smooth. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and withdrew a thick, unsealed ivory envelope. He tossed it onto the mahogany desk where it landed with a heavy thud. "You are done in this house. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. There is $50,000 in that envelope, a generous severance for someone in your position. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal belongings from the staff quarters and vacate the premises. My driver, Thomas, will take you wherever you wish to go within state lines. You will not return." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the window panes. Nora stared at the thick white envelope, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. $50,000 was a staggering amount of money. It was enough to pay off her mother's crushing medical debts and secure a decent apartment away from the crumbling neighborhood she currently called home. But the money didn't make sense. None of it made sense. "Sir, I don't understand," Nora stammered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Did I do something wrong? Did I break something? If it was the crystal vase in the foyer last week, I swear I didn't touch it. I can work harder. Please, Mr. Castellano, I need this job. The health insurance—" "This is not a negotiation, Miss Higgins," Arthur said coldly. He stepped closer, towering over her. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. "You have been deemed a liability to the operational security of this household. The decision is final. You will take the money, you will get in the car, and you will forget you ever set foot on this property. If you attempt to contact anyone in this house, including the staff, the consequences will be far less generous than what sits on that desk. Do we understand each other?" Tears pricked the corners of Nora's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was terrified, completely bewildered, and utterly powerless. She had been nothing but a ghost in this massive, brooding mansion. She hadn't gossiped, she hadn't snooped in the private filing cabinets, she hadn't even dared to look closely at the men who came and went at all hours of the night carrying heavy duffel bags. Why was she suddenly a liability? Without another word, Arthur turned his back on her, staring out at the violent storm. The dismissal was absolute. Nora's shaking hands reached out and grasped the envelope. It was heavy, packed tight with $100 bills. She clutched it to her chest, feeling a sickening knot tighten in her stomach. She gave a stiff, jerky nod to his back, turned and fled the library. As she sprinted down the long, carpeted hallways towards the servants' quarters, her mind raced. She packed her meager belongings into a battered canvas duffel bag, her movements frantic. Evelyn, the stern house manager, stood in the doorway, her face an unreadable mask of stone, ensuring Nora left exactly within the 15-minute window. Nora didn't look back as she climbed into the back of the sleek black SUV idling in the torrential rain, as the gates of the Castellano estate closed heavily behind her, sealing her out of that terrifying world. A single, agonizing thought echoed in her mind. What had she done? The truth, hidden deep within the sprawling walls of the mansion, was something far more sinister than a broken vase or a misplaced document. Arthur Castellano, a man of infinite calculation, had just made the gravest mistake of his life, and he had done it entirely on the advice of a traitor. The Castellano estate was a fortress of quiet discipline, but in the days following Nora Higgins' abrupt departure, the silence morphed into something suffocating and heavy. At the epicenter of this stifling atmosphere was Leo Castellano. 7 years old, with a shock of dark, untamable hair and eyes the color of bruised storm clouds, Leo was the sole heir to his father's blood-stained empire. He was also a boy, completely locked inside his own mind. Leo had not uttered a single word in 3 years, not since the horrific night his mother, Isabella Castellano, was killed in a drive-by shooting that had decimated Arthur's security detail and shattered the boy's world. Since that night of shattered glass and screaming sirens, Leo's voice had simply vanished. He retreated into a fortress of absolute mutiny against the world. Arthur, desperate and grieving in his own violent way, had spent millions on the best child psychologists, behavioral therapists, and speech pathologists the East Coast had to offer. None of them could breach the walls Leo had built. Until Nora. Nora had never tried to force Leo to speak. When she was assigned to clean the East Wing, where Leo's playroom was located, she didn't treat him like a broken porcelain doll or a frustrating puzzle, as the expensive doctors did. She treated him like a shadow, much like herself. Their bond had formed in the quiet spaces between her duties. One afternoon, finding him staring blankly at a complex wooden puzzle, Nora had simply sat on the floor opposite him, quietly sliding a piece into place before returning to a dusting. The next day, he had left a piece out for her. Soon they were communicating in a silent language of shared glances, small sketches left on notepads, and quiet companionship. Nora would leave a freshly baked ginger cookie on the edge of his desk. Leo would leave a perfectly folded origami crane on her cleaning cart. She was his tether to a world that terrified him. When Leo woke up 2 days after the library incident and found a severe, unfamiliar woman named Greta replacing Nora in the hallways, the fragile tether snapped. The rebellion began quietly. At first, it was simple acts of defiance. The expensive, meticulously prepared meals prepared by the private chef were violently pushed off the dining table, shattering the antique china. The behavioral therapist Arthur had flown in from Boston was locked inside a walk-in closet for 3 hours. Leo refused to sleep in his bed, choosing instead to curl up in a tight, trembling ball beneath the grand piano in the music room, clutching a small, slightly crumpled origami crane. Arthur watched his son's rapid deterioration with a mixture of profound sorrow and rising, impotent rage. He was a man who commanded thousands of loyal soldiers, a man who could alter the political landscape of the city with a single phone call, yet he was completely powerless to comfort his own child. "He needs discipline, Mr. Castellano," advised Richard Sterling, Arthur's underboss and closest confidant. Richard was a smooth, immaculately groomed man with eyes that never quite smiled when his mouth did. He stood in Arthur's study, pouring a glass of aged bourbon. "The boy is acting out because the maid allowed him to be soft. You did the right thing removing her. She was a distraction, a weak point." Arthur stared into the fireplace, watching the flames devour the heavy oak logs. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days, Richard. He threw a brass paperweight at Evelyn this morning. He's looking for her." "He will adapt," Richard insisted smoothly, handing Arthur the crystal glass. "He is a Castellano. He has your blood in his veins. He just needs time to forget the girl. You can't let a servant dictate the emotional state of your heir. Remember why we let her go, Arthur. She was asking too many questions. She was lingering near the restricted files." Arthur took a sip of the burning liquid, the taste turning to ash in his mouth. Richard had brought him the security footage a week ago, grainy, silent clips of Nora pausing a fraction too long near the filing cabinets in the study, her eyes darting towards the hidden safe behind the portrait of Isabella. Richard had convinced him she was a plant, a spy, working for a rival family or the feds. In Arthur's world, suspicion was identical to guilt. He had fired her instantly, cutting out the infection before it could spread. But as he looked at the dark circles under his son's eyes later that evening, Arthur felt a rare, agonizing twinge of doubt. It was midnight when the tension in the house finally shattered. Arthur was sitting in his darkened study, nursing his 3rd glass of bourbon, the silence of the massive house pressing in on him. The heavy oak doors creaked open. Arthur reached instinctively for the cold steel of the Sig Sauer hidden in his desk drawer, but stopped when he saw the small silhouette standing in the doorway. It was Leo. He was wearing his blue pajamas, his feet bare against the cold marble floor. In his small, trembling hands, he held the crumpled origami crane and a piece of heavily folded paper. "Leo," Arthur breathed, his heart clenching. He stood up, abandoning his drink. "What are you doing out of bed? It's late." Leo didn't run away. He didn't cower. Instead, he walked with mechanical, determined steps straight toward his terrifying father. He bypassed the large sitting chairs and marched right up to the mahogany desk. He slammed the folded piece of paper down onto the polished wood, right over the spot where the envelope of cash had sat days earlier. Arthur looked down at the paper. It was a drawing, a rough, frantic sketch done in heavy black crayon. It depicted a tall man with slicked-back hair, undeniably Richard Sterling, standing near Arthur's desk. In the man's hand was a small black square. He was pushing it underneath the heavy wooden rim of the desk, and standing in the doorway, drawn in a pale grey crayon, was the unmistakable figure of a maid. Arthur's breath hitched. He looked from the drawing to his son's fierce, desperate eyes. "What is this, Leo?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper, a strange dread pooling in his stomach. Leo stared at him, his small chest heaving. His jaw trembled, and for a terrifying second, Arthur thought the boy was going to scream. Instead, Leo took a deep, shuddering breath, opened his mouth, and broke 3 years of absolute, agonizing silence. The bug. The words were so raspy, so fragile from years of disuse, that Arthur almost didn't catch them. He froze, the air abandoning his lungs. The glass of bourbon slipped from his fingers, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces against the hardwood floor, sending a spray of amber liquid across his imported Italian shoes. He didn't notice. He couldn't tear his eyes away from his 7-year-old son. "Leo!" Arthur choked out, falling to his knees so he was eye level with the boy. He reached out, his large, calloused hands hovering just inches from Leo's trembling shoulders, terrified that if he touched him, the illusion would break. "Leo, did you just speak?" Leo swallowed hard, his face a mask of fierce, terrifying determination that looked painfully identical to his father's. He pointed a small, accusatory finger at the heavy oak desk. "The bug," Leo repeated, his voice gaining a fraction of volume, sounding like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Under the wood. Mr. Richard put it there. Nora saw him." The room began to spin. Arthur's brilliant tactical mind, usually processing 100 variables a second, slammed to a complete halt. He stared at the desk, then at the crayon drawing, and finally back at his son. A cold, venomous clarity began to wash over him, freezing the blood in his veins. "Show me," Arthur commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth, vibrating with a deadly, quiet intensity. Leo didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, crawling under the massive mahogany structure. Arthur followed, his bespoke suit dragging against the floor. Leo pointed to the thick, ornate wooden paneling on the underside of the desk, right above where Arthur's knees usually rested. It was a spot entirely hidden from plain view, practically invisible unless you were flat on your back looking up. Arthur reached his hand up, his fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. He felt nothing at first. Then his fingertips brushed against something cold, metallic, and decidedly foreign. It was smaller than a dime, attached with an industrial-grade adhesive. He pried it loose with his thumbnail and brought it out into the dim light of the study. It was a state-of-the-art, military-grade audio transmitter, the kind federal agents used, the kind that required internal access to place, the kind that had been transmitting every single meeting, every whispered command, every illicit transaction Arthur had conducted in this room for God knows how long. Arthur stared at the tiny black device in his palm. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, painting a picture so utterly horrifying it made him physically nauseous. Richard Sterling, his underboss, his right hand, the man who had stood beside him at his wife's funeral and swore loyalty and blood. Richard had planted the device, and Richard had been the one to bring him the security footage of Nora. She was asking too many questions, Richard had said. She was lingering near the restricted files. Arthur closed his eyes, a wave of profound self-disgust crashing over him. Nora hadn't been snooping. She had been cleaning the underside of the desk. She was the most meticulous maid they had ever hired. She must have found the device. She probably hadn't even known what it was. But she had seen Richard tampering with the desk. Richard had realized she was a threat to his treason, and instead of killing her, which would have raised too many questions and brought the police to the estate, he had manipulated Arthur into doing his dirty work. He had used Arthur's own paranoia against him to banish the only witness. "Nora tried to show you," Leo croaked, his voice breaking Arthur's horrific realization. The boy was staring at him, his bruised eyes filled with tears. "She drew it for me. She didn't know how to tell you. She was scared of you." "She was scared of me," Arthur repeated softly, the words tasting like poison. He had threatened her. He had thrown money at her and kicked her out into a thunderstorm, completely blind to the fact that she was the only one in the house trying to protect him. But the devastation didn't end there. If Richard had planted a bug in the study, it wasn't just to gather evidence. Richard was ambitious. He didn't want Arthur in prison. He wanted Arthur's throne. He wanted to take over the Castellano syndicate, and to do that, he needed Arthur dead. The bug was merely a way to monitor Arthur's movements, to know exactly when he was vulnerable. Arthur stood up slowly, the tiny transmitter still clutched tightly in his fist. The sorrow and confusion that had plagued him for days instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly absolute wrath. He was the architect. He did not get outplayed in his own house. "Leo," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He reached out and gently cupped his son's cheek, his thumbs wiping away a single tear. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are going to go upstairs, lock your door, and hide under your bed. You will not come out until I come and get you. Do you understand?" Leo nodded, his small face pale. He understood the tone. It was the same tone his father used before men vanished. "I am going to fix this," Arthur promised, his eyes burning with dark, lethal intent. "I am going to find Nora, and I am going to bring her back. And then I am going to have a very long conversation with Uncle Richard." As Leo turned and ran silently up the grand staircase, Arthur walked over to his desk. He didn't use the secure landline. He pulled his encrypted cell phone from his pocket and dialed a number he only used for extreme emergencies. "Evelyn," Arthur said when the house manager answered on the first ring, "wake up the security team. Lock down the estate. Nobody enters, nobody leaves. Specifically, locate Richard Sterling. If he tries to run, break his legs." He hung up, the silence of the library settling around him once more. But this time, it was not the silence of a tomb. It was the silence before a massacre. Arthur Castellano had made a mistake. But the punishment for those who had orchestrated it would be biblical. Red emergency lights bathed the polished marble foyer of the Castellano estate in a bloody, rhythmic glow. The moment Arthur disconnected the call, the sprawling mansion transformed from a quiet, brooding residence into a heavily fortified military installation. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing out the violent November storm. Armed men in tactical gear poured from the hidden corridors, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood as they secured the perimeter. Arthur stood at the top of the grand staircase, his eyes cold and unblinking, watching the chaotic precision of his men. He was no longer the grieving father. He was the apex predator of the New York underworld, and his sanctuary had been breached. "Boss!" a rough voice echoed from the bottom of the stairs. It was Dominic, Arthur's head of security, a massive, scarred veteran of countless turf wars who valued loyalty above breathing. He was dragging a struggling, immaculately dressed figure by the collar of his expensive, bespoke suit. Richard Sterling was violently thrown to the marble floor. His perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled, and a fresh, bleeding, split lip marred his usually smug face. He coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the pristine floor, before looking up at Arthur with a mixture of terror and lingering defiance. "He was trying to slip out through the subterranean garage," Dominic growled, keeping a heavy hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Had a go-bag packed with $500,000 in bearer bonds and 2 forged passports. He knew the lockdown was coming." Arthur descended the stairs slowly, the rhythmic tapping of his Italian leather shoes echoing like a metronome, counting down to an execution. He stopped 2 feet away from his former right-hand man, the tiny military-grade audio transmitter still clenched tightly in his fist. He opened his hand, letting the black device fall to the floor. It clattered against the marble, coming to a rest mere inches from Richard's face. "A Castellano never acts without absolute certainty, Richard," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. The surrounding guards visibly stiffened at the sheer malice radiating from their boss. "You taught me that rule yourself, 10 years ago. Yet, you gambled your life on the assumption that a 7-year-old boy would remain silent forever. That was a fatal miscalculation." Richard stared at the bug, his face draining of color until it matched the pale marble beneath him. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the polished stone. "Arthur, listen to me. It's not what it looks like. The feds, they cornered me. Detective Harrison. He had wiretaps on the offshore accounts. He threatened my family. I had to give them something, just to keep them at bay." "Do not insult my intelligence by lying to my face," Arthur interrupted smoothly. He gestured sharply to Dominic. "Bring him to the wine cellar. We are going to have a private conversation about the Marcano family." The temperature in the subterranean wine cellar was strictly regulated to 55 degrees, but to Richard it felt like freezing water. The room was lined with thousands of bottles of vintage Bordeaux and Pinot Noir, casting long, distorted shadows in the dim lighting. Dominic forced Richard into a heavy wooden chair in the center of the room, binding his wrists tightly with industrial zip ties. Arthur poured himself a glass of a 1982 vintage, taking a slow, deliberate sip before turning his attention back to the trembling man. "The feds don't use this specific frequency, Richard," Arthur stated factually, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. "This is cartel tech, which means you bypassed the police entirely. You sold me out to Salvatore Marcano. You were going to feed him my shipping routes, my schedules, and eventually the layout of my personal security detail. You were going to let him assassinate me, and in return, he would back your claim as the new head of the Castellano syndicate." Richard's breathing grew ragged. The facade of the smooth, calculating underboss shattered completely. "Arthur, please, you don't understand the pressure. You've been a ghost since Isabella died. The men are losing faith. You spend all your time locked in that study or staring at the boy. We are losing territory in Brooklyn. I did what had to be done to save the business." "You used my grief to mask your treason," Arthur replied coldly. "But that is an internal matter. That is between you and me. What I want to know about is the girl, Nora Higgins." At the mention of the maid's name, Richard flinched violently. A bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. "She was under the desk, Arthur," Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the cellar. "I was replacing the battery on the transmitter. She came in early to polish the brass. She saw me. She didn't say anything, but she looked right at the device. I knew she was sharp. I knew she would eventually figure out it didn't belong." "So you manipulated me into firing her," Arthur deduced, stepping closer, his imposing frame blocking out the overhead light. "You used my paranoia. You showed me the footage, told me she was a spy. It was the cleanest way," Richard cried out defensively. "If I killed her here, in the house, it would bring the police to the estate. It would disrupt everything. I needed her out of the secure zone. You firing her was perfect. It put her out on the street, completely unprotected." Arthur's blood ran cold. The glass in his hand cracked under the sudden, immense pressure of his grip. "What do you mean, out on the street?" Richard let out a dark, desperate chuckle, realizing his fate was already sealed. "You think I was just going to let her walk away with 50 grand and a memory of my face? Salvatore Marcano doesn't leave loose ends, Arthur. The moment your driver dropped her off in Queens, Marcano's cleaners were dispatched. She's a liability. They are wiping her off the map tonight." The silence in the cellar was absolute, heavy with the weight of impending death. Arthur stared at Richard, the horrifying reality of the situation sinking in. He had personally handed Nora over to her executioners. He had stripped her of the estate's protection, thrown her into the storm, and painted a target on her back. Arthur turned his back on Richard, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He looked at Dominic, who was already drawing his weapon with practiced efficiency. "Find out exactly where they sent her," Arthur commanded, his voice devoid of all humanity. "Then break his hands, so he can never hold a pen to sign away another life. Leave him down here. He doesn't get to see the sun again." As Arthur sprinted up the stairs toward the heavily armored garage, the muffled sound of Richard's screams echoed from the cellar, but Arthur didn't even blink. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his reinforced black SUV, the engine roaring to life with the ferocity of a caged beast. He punched the coordinates Thomas had provided into the GPS, Astoria Boulevard, Queens. The clock was ticking, and Arthur Castellano was about to tear New York City apart to save the woman he had so ruthlessly discarded. Rain hammered against the cracked window of apartment 4B, the relentless drumming doing nothing to drown out the violent symphony of the Queens slums. Sirens wailed in the distance, and the neon sign from the liquor store across the street cast a sickly, intermittent red glow across the cramped, peeling walls. Nora Higgins sat on the edge of a lumpy, stained mattress, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. The canvas duffel bag lay open on the scuffed linoleum floor. The thick ivory envelope was empty. Earlier that afternoon, braving the torrential downpour, she had taken 3 buses to Mount Sinai Hospital. She had walked straight into the billing department and slapped $30,000 in cash onto the counter, clearing her mother's extensive chemotherapy debts in one miraculous, terrifying swoop. The remaining $20,000 was hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary on the rickety bookshelf. It was enough to move them out of state, to start over somewhere safe. But as Nora sat in the darkness, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, she knew that no amount of money could buy off the suffocating paranoia gripping her throat. She knew what she had seen. She hadn't just been cleaning the desk. She had been dusting the intricate wooden carvings when Richard Sterling walked in. He hadn't seen her immediately because she was tucked beneath the heavy mahogany frame. She had watched him press that tiny black square against the wood. She had seen the sheer panic in his eyes when he finally noticed her. She had played dumb, apologizing profusely and rushing out. But she wasn't an idiot. You didn't survive 22 years in the poorest neighborhoods of New York without recognizing a snake when it was coiled to strike. She had wanted to tell Mr. Castellano. She had tried to draw it for Leo, hoping the boy could somehow communicate the danger to his terrifying father. But Arthur's sudden, ruthless dismissal had shattered any chance of that. Now, she was alone, trapped in a decaying building, waiting for the other shoe to drop. A heavy, unnatural clunk echoed from the metal fire escape outside her window. Nora froze, her breath instantly catching in her lungs. The wind howled, rattling the loose window pane. But that sound hadn't been the wind. It was the distinct scrape of heavy boots against wet iron. She slid off the mattress silently, her bare feet making no sound against the linoleum. She crept toward the tiny kitchenette, her trembling fingers wrapping around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet. It was a pathetic weapon against the kind of monsters that worked for the syndicate, but it was all she had. In the hallway outside her front door, a floorboard groaned. They weren't just on the fire escape. They were in the building. They were surrounding her. Suddenly the lock on her flimsy wooden door began to click rapidly, the unmistakable sound of lockpicks biting into the cheap brass. Nora backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She raised the skillet, tears of sheer, unadulterated terror streaming down her face. She was going to die here, in this filthy apartment, and her mother would never know what happened to her. The clicking stopped. For a split second, there was absolute, terrifying silence. Then the door literally exploded inward. Splinters of cheap wood and twisted metal rained across the living room as a massive, dark figure kicked the door off its hinges with devastating force. A man in a dark trench coat stumbled into the room, a suppressed pistol raised. But before he could even aim at Nora, a second figure moved with terrifying, blinding speed from the hallway. Arthur Castellano gripped the hitman by the back of his coat, violently slamming him face first into the doorframe. The sickening crunch of bone echoed through the small apartment. The hitman slumped to the floor, unconscious before he even realized he was under attack. From the fire escape window, the glass shattered inward as a second hitman kicked his way in, raising a shotgun. Arthur didn't even flinch. He drew his Sig Sauer with a fluid, practiced motion and fired 2 silenced precision shots. The hitman dropped like a stone, tumbling backward out the window and disappearing into the rainy night. The apartment plunged back into a ringing, heavy silence. broken only by the rain blowing in through the shattered window. Nora stood glued to the floor, the cast-iron skillet shaking violently in her hands. She stared at the bodies, and then slowly raised her terrified eyes to the man standing in the center of her ruined living room. Arthur Castellano was soaked to the bone. His expensive charcoal suit was ruined, plastered to his broad shoulders by the rain. Blood, not his own, stained his pristine white cuffs. He was breathing heavily, his dark eyes sweeping the room, assessing the threat level with cold, mechanical efficiency. When his eyes finally locked onto Nora, the lethal, terrifying aura surrounding him instantly vanished. The apex predator disappeared, replaced by something Nora had never seen in the Mafia boss. Profound, desperate relief. "Stay back!" Nora shrieked, her voice cracking as she took a shaky step backward, raising the skillet higher. "Don't come near me. I didn't tell anyone, I swear. I don't know anything." Arthur immediately holstered his weapon. He raised his hands slowly, palms facing outward, a universal gesture of surrender. "Nora, put the pan down," Arthur said. His deep voice was surprisingly gentle, completely devoid of the icy authority he usually wielded. "I am not here to hurt you. Those men, they work for Salvatore Marcano. Richard sent them. I came here to stop them." "You fired me," Nora sobbed, the trauma of the last few days finally breaking her composure. "You threw me out. Why would you come here? Why is this happening to me?" Arthur took a slow, cautious step forward, as if approaching a wounded, terrified animal. He didn't care about the rain ruining his shoes, or the dead hitman bleeding on the linoleum. He only cared about the terrified girl trembling before him. "I fired you because I was a blind, paranoid fool," Arthur confessed, the admission costing him every ounce of his immense pride. "Richard manipulated me. He convinced me you were a threat because he knew you saw him planting the bug under my desk. He used my instinct to protect my family against the very person who was actually trying to save us." Nora's eyes widened, the skillet lowering an inch. "You found it?" Arthur nodded slowly, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. A smile of pure, unbelievable gratitude. "I didn't find it, Nora. Leo did." Nora gasped, her hands falling to her sides. The skillet hit the floor with a loud clang. "Leo?" "He brought me the drawing you made for him," Arthur said, his voice thickening with sudden, overwhelming emotion. He closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that shook Nora to her core. "He marched right into my study, slammed your drawing on my desk, and he told me to look." Nora covered her mouth with both hands, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "He told you he spoke?" "He spoke your name, Nora," Arthur whispered, the reality of the miracle still washing over him. "He broke 3 years of silence to save your life, and to save mine." Arthur slowly reached out, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around Nora's trembling fingers. It was the first time they had ever touched. The warmth of his grip sent a strange, powerful jolt through her exhausted body. "You are not safe here," Arthur said, his tone shifting back to the decisive, protective leader, but lacking the cruelty from the library. "Marcano knows you are a loose end. If he sent 2 cleaners, he will send a dozen more when these fail to report back. You are coming with me." "I can't go back there," Nora whispered, looking at the blood on the floor. "I don't belong in your world, Mr. Castellano. I just want to be invisible again." "My name is Arthur," he corrected her softly, his grip tightening protectively. "And invisibility is no longer an option, Nora. You saved the heir to the Castellano Empire. You are under my protection now, and anyone who tries to touch you will answer to me." Before Nora could process the weight of his words, the distant wail of police sirens suddenly grew deafeningly loud. Red and blue lights began flashing violently against the brick wall outside the shattered window. They weren't just passing by, they were pulling up directly outside the apartment building. Arthur's head snapped towards the window, his jaw clenching. He instantly recognized the unmarked black sedans boxing in the squad cars. "That's not just the local police," Arthur growled, pulling his weapon back out and shielding Nora behind his massive frame. "That's Detective Harrison. Richard must have tipped off the feds as a failsafe." They were trapped on the 4th floor, with a dead hitman in the doorway, the feds storming the front entrance, and a rival Mafia syndicate hunting them from the shadows. The true war for the Castellano Empire had just begun. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed up the narrow, decaying stairwell of the Queen's apartment building. Detective Robert Harrison was barking orders, his voice carrying the distinct, authoritative boom of a federal raid. Inside the cramped living room of apartment 4B, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. Arthur did not hesitate. The Mafia boss grabbed Nora's trembling wrist, his grip firm but careful, pulling her away from the shattered front door and towards the narrow fire escape. "We are going up, not down," Arthur ordered, his voice barely a whisper against the howling November storm. "The feds will sweep the ground floor first. We need the roof." Nora stumbled over the linoleum, her bare feet slipping on the rain-slicked floor. She grabbed her canvas duffel bag instinctively, the $30,000 for her mother's medical bills already paid, but her life now hanging by a thread. They scrambled out the window, the freezing rain instantly soaking Nora to the bone. The metal grate of the fire escape groaned dangerously under Arthur's weight as he led the way, his Sig Sauer raised and scanning the chaotic alleyway below. Red and blue lights painted the brick walls in frantic bursts. Uniformed officers were securing the perimeter, unaware that the undisputed king of the East Coast Syndicate was climbing the rusted iron directly above them. Nora's chest heaved, sheer terror threatening to paralyze her. She was a maid, a girl who scrubbed floors for minimum wage, and now she was scaling a building in a thunderstorm with a lethal criminal mastermind. "Keep moving, Nora. Don't look down," Arthur commanded softly, sensing her hesitation. His broad shoulders shielded her from the worst of the wind. They reached the tar-covered roof just as a massive crash echoed from below. Detective Harrison had breached the apartment. Arthur kicked the heavy roof access door shut and jammed a rusted steel pipe through the handle, buying them a few precious minutes. The storm raged around them, the New York skyline a blurred, jagged silhouette against the dark clouds. "We are trapped," Nora cried out, the wind snatching her words. "They have the entire block surrounded. Why did you come for me? You could have stayed in your fortress. You could have been safe." Arthur turned to face her, the cold rain washing the blood from his hands. The ruthless, untouchable persona of the Castellano Empire was gone, replaced by a man fiercely determined to protect the only person who had ever truly tried to protect his son. "My fortress was a lie, Nora. Richard poisoned it. You were the only honest thing inside those walls. Leo knew it, and I was too blind to see it." He pulled a sleek, encrypted satellite phone from his ruined suit jacket. He punched in a short sequence of numbers. "Dominic, execute Protocol Phoenix. Sector 4, rooftop extraction. 2 minutes." Nora stared at him in disbelief. "What is Protocol Phoenix?" Before Arthur could answer, the heavy steel access door behind them shuddered violently. Sparks flew as a breaching charge was planted on the hinges. The feds were cutting through. Arthur pulled Nora behind the concrete housing of the ventilation shaft, shielding her body with his own. "Hold your breath," Arthur warned, his eyes locked on the door. A deafening explosion ripped through the night air, blowing the roof access door completely off its hinges. Smoke and brick dust plumed into the rain. Detective Harrison stepped through the wreckage, his weapon drawn, flanked by 3 heavily armored SWAT officers. "It's over, Castellano!" Harrison bellowed, his voice laced with decades of frustrated pursuit. "Drop the weapon and step out. You have nowhere left to run. We have Sterling in custody, and he is singing like a canary." Arthur's expression remained terrifyingly calm. He didn't drop his weapon. Instead, he looked up at the stormy sky. Through the thick, churning clouds, a low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate in Nora's chest. It wasn't thunder. The sound grew rapidly, morphing into the deafening roar of twin turbine engines. A massive, matte black helicopter descended violently from the storm, its powerful spotlights blinding the federal agents and blowing a hurricane of rainwater across the roof. The extraction had arrived. The sheer force of the helicopter's rotor wash threw the heavily armed tactical team off balance. Detective Harrison shielded his eyes against the blinding halogen spotlights, his shouted commands completely swallowed by the mechanical roar. The black aircraft hovered mere feet above the tar-slicked roof, the side door sliding open to reveal Dominic, Arthur's massive head of security, strapped in and laying down a wall of suppressing fire near the agent's feet, never aiming to kill the police, only to pin them down. "Go!" Arthur roared, wrapping a strong arm around Nora's waist. He practically lifted her off the ground, rushing her through the blinding rain and turbulent wind. Nora scrambled into the metal cabin, her hands violently shaking as she grabbed the safety harness. Arthur vaulted in immediately after her, slamming his fist against the bulkhead. The pilot banked hard, and the helicopter instantly surged upward, swallowed by the thick, churning storm clouds before Harrison could even recover his footing. Inside the vibrating cabin, the deafening noise of the rotors made conversation impossible. Nora sat shivering, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin. Arthur reached into an overhead compartment, pulling out a thick, dry, tactical blanket and wrapping it gently around her shoulders. His dark eyes met hers, silently promising that the nightmare was finally over. They flew through their storm, touching down an hour later at a heavily guarded private airstrip hidden in the dense forests of upstate New York. A sleek, twin-engine private jet sat idling on the tarmac, ready to vanish into international airspace. By dawn, as their plane soared above the clouds, the Castellano syndicate back in the city was violently purged. Dominic and the Loyalists executed a flawless, ruthless counterstrike. Salvatore Marcano's lieutenants were ambushed. The rival family's power structure evaporated in a single morning. Richard Sterling, having betrayed both sides, vanished without a trace, a permanent ghost in the underground vaults of the estate, a brutal act of karma for his treason. 2 days later, the morning sun poured through the reinforced windows of a luxurious private suite on a secluded tropical island. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world quiet and washed clean. Nora stood near the balcony, pouring a cup of coffee. She was no longer wearing a grey maid's uniform, but a soft, elegant silk robe. Small footsteps padded across the polished floorboards. Nora turned and felt her breath catch in her throat. Leo stood in the doorway, clutching a freshly folded origami airplane. The dark circles under the 7-year-old's eyes had faded, replaced by a cautious, fragile light. "Good morning, Leo," Nora whispered, kneeling down to his eye level. Leo stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. "You came back," the boy rasped softly, his voice still hoarse but completely clear. "I will never leave you again," Nora promised, holding him tightly, tears of profound relief sliding down her cheeks. Arthur stood silently in the hallway, watching the two most important people in his world. He stepped into the room, his imposing presence now bringing absolute comfort rather than terror. He placed a gentle hand on Leo's head, then reached out to lightly touch Nora's cheek. "We start over," Arthur said, his voice a deep, steady vow. "No more shadows. No more fear. Just us." Nora smiled, leaning into his touch. The king had lost his criminal empire, trading his bloody crown for the safety of his family. But as they looked out over the endless ocean, they both knew the future was finally theirs. And that is how the terrifying reign of Arthur Castellano ended, not with a bullet or a federal indictment, but with the quiet courage of a desperate maid and the breaking of a little boy's silence. Love and loyalty managed to dismantle an empire built entirely on fear. What did you think of Nora's bravery and Arthur's ultimate sacrifice? Would you have risked everything to save someone who had just fired you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this intense Mafia romance drama, and want to hear more thrilling, real-life storytelling filled with dark twists and unexpected redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a good suspenseful romance, and make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss our next gripping tale. Thanks for watching.